Hello and welcome to the Chopin competition studio. My name is Wojciech Bońkowski and I am delighted to greet Professor John Rink, who is a member of the jury this year, but also one of the most distinguished Chopin scholars. So the topic I wanted to talk about is intuition in performance. Mm-hmm. You wrote a study, an essay that was recently republished in Polish about intuition in performance, but also you speak a lot about the musical mind. So understanding a work of music. How can pianists reconcile intuition, spontaneity with analysis?
I think we have to remember that intuition is not the same as instinct. Humans have relatively few instinctual behaviors, but we do act intuitively all the time. And intuition is something that doesn't require a great deal of conscious thought. It happens rather spontaneously, but it draws upon a bed of knowledge, a foundation of knowledge, which is laid over time. And so the musical mind is one that knows how to use intuition, to rely on it where necessary, and to go beyond it in other cases. So what I'm really talking about is knowledge and experience accrued over time, put to use on the spot when required. And that can result in lightning decisions, which may not even be consciously formed, lightning decisions which could be of the greatest importance and insight in a performance, or indeed any other activity.
A lot of the pianists that we interviewed before the competition were speaking about playing from the heart. You know, they want to be emotional because Chopin is perceived as the emotional romantic composer. But then they have to analyze the work that they're playing to see the structure and the narrative. So again, how to reconcile that? Can we expect from 20-year-olds to have a deep knowledge of musical structures, genres, history?
I think playing from the heart, if you like, from the soul, if you prefer, is absolutely essential. And what one does in acquiring knowledge is to get a kind of a set of ammunition that one can use in resolving difficulties and certain problems. But ultimately what matters is the music, not the possessing of knowledge. When one is giving a concert, it's not the same as giving a lecture, for instance. So the musician, perhaps in the practice room, will use the knowledge to solve problems, to work things out, and that may certainly involve and require analysis of various kinds. But when you're on stage, you're not actually engaged in the act of analysis or any other kind of scholarly act, but you may draw upon that knowledge without necessarily realizing it. So I see no necessary tension between the acquisition of knowledge, the attempt to acquire knowledge, and playing from the heart. The two, I think, go very much hand in hand and probably are required. Now, a 20-year-old pianist inevitably is going to have less experience in many respects than somebody who's 30, 40, 50 or older, but that doesn't mean that their experiences are invalid or immature necessarily. What we're seeing on the stage of the competition now is some really very, very fine pianism reflecting a great deal of thought, which may not necessarily be conscious. On the other hand, it may be. We don't know. But there's an awful lot of great wisdom already on stage, as well as signs of the need for further wisdom, which will develop over time thereafter. It's a mix.
How important is score in all of that? Because we often hear about faithfulness to the score. Now, a musical score is a very, very complex system of notation. It's really difficult to remember all the indications that are inserted in the score by the composer. So knowing the music by heart is hardly knowing every single sign that's been written in. How do you regard that? Do you think it's imperative that the score is really faithfully rendered, or is there an amount of freedom that is allowed for the pianist?
Yes, I mean there are many different ways of answering that. Of course, in Chopin's case particularly, there is no one single score in most instances which one could turn to as reliable. Chopin continually changed his mind. You might go to different manuscripts or different versions of the first editions or exemplars used by his students and find a different reading of the work from Chopin's own perspective. So which one is necessarily right? Well, in a sense, they could all be right. They could all be construed as coming from Chopin. Now, having defined that kind of flexibility or potential flexibility, what responsibility is there then for the performer with regard to the score? We must remember that scores do not define everything. In fact, scores are only suggestions, if you like. We often say that notation, musical notation, is underdetermined, it's underdefined. And there are many, many things that you couldn't possibly capture in notation, such as rhythmic flexibility or dynamic nuance. And so a score is always going to be nothing more than a starting point or a point that you might return to, but it's not going to give you everything. And so what the artist has to do, the musician has to do, is to construct the music on the basis of those suggestions, but the end result is going to be much greater than the score could possibly stretch to. And that's the beauty of performance. It's also potentially a risk. I think there is a sense of responsibility that we as performers should have with regard to composers' intentions in a certain respect, but after another point, it really is down to us to make of the music what we wish. It is our music too. We share the music with the composer. We co-create with the composer.
But surely there must be a limit of what the pianist can do with the score, and many are accused of too many liberties. That was especially typical in the 19th century. Now it's interesting because those pianists also had a more direct connection with the Chopin tradition, and yet they approached the score extremely freely. Today it's slightly a reverse situation. Is that a paradox?
Well, one might ask, are all extremes bad? Are there any extremes that are acceptable or good? I think, first of all, the answer to that would depend on one's perspective. There will be some who are more purist, if you like, and for them, if you like, a more mainstream or traditional interpretation would be necessary. But if you approach it with a different sort of perspective, I think possibly it's potentially a richer experience, because I myself try to make sense of whatever performance I hear in the terms defined by the musician or musicians in question. And so there can be extreme liberties taken, great flights of imagination, but somehow it has to work within the context of the performance. And I think that's the ultimate responsibility of the performer, to make it work in the context of that performance, whatever one is doing. And I think that becomes a source of liberation rather than potential constraint. The score is a starting point, but it's then up to us to do with it what we want. What people think of it is up to them to decide. And some will love, some will hate the same performance.
But that's an even greater responsibility for who listens to the music and also scores it, like you do as a member of the jury, right? To acknowledge the conception of any single pianist.
Absolutely. The work of a member of the jury is precisely that, is to judge the work of the pianist in the terms that he or she is setting, also against the expectations that we bring as to what Chopin intended on the one hand, and also what one might do with the music of Chopin. There's no fixed set of criteria, no set of parameters that you can apply in a routine manner. What we have to do in the 25 to 30 to whatever minutes we have available is to get to know the person and personality in front of us. It's immensely difficult to do that in such a short time, but it's also very exciting. So we have, one after the other, a succession of personalities which we try to get to know to the nth degree on the basis of the evidence that they present.
Do you think if Chopin just walked on stage today in round 2, would he move on to round 3?
Well, there's another question. Would Chopin consent to take part in a competition such as this? Chopin never played in a space as big as the one in which the competition is taking place, nor of course did he have a piano of the same nature. He probably would have loved to have played that piano, but he no doubt would have made the piano work in his particular way, and I suspect consistent with the performance aesthetic that we know. I imagine that there would be judges at a certain competition, maybe not this one, they would hear a Chopin play and say it's too quiet, it's too delicate, it's too intimate. These were criticisms that were always made of Chopin's playing. I suspect it would be true today. What that really requires, however, is very, very careful listening. Whoever is listening, whether it's a member of a jury or a member of a public or whoever, really needs to listen very carefully and do exactly what I said before, and that is make sense of the music as it is being presented to us according to its particular aesthetic, insofar as that is consistent. And that's where some pianists, of course, fall short and others excel.
Professor John Rink, thank you very much for joining us today.